Good morning and welcome to Grand River Outfitting and Fly Shop in Fergus, Ontario. Today we're going to be discussing an area of fly fishing that often gets overlooked and or can be very confusing, and that is whether or not we can overweight a fly line to get better results. The question gets asked to us here at the shop enough is, first of all, can you overweight your fly line? Or your fly rod, and why would you? Where would it best apply, and does it make sense to? Well, the simple answer is yes to all of the above. You can overweight your fly rod. It does make sense in certain applications, and we'll get to that as we go through it a little further. But first of all, let's talk about what is overweighting your fly rod. Sorry. Overweighting your fly rod is basically putting on a line weight that is heavier than what the rod calls for. So you may take a 6-weight line and put a 7-weight line on it. Back in the 60s, in the early 60s, the American Fly Fishing Trade Association came up with a standardized system for fly lines. Prior to this system, fly lines were generally measured by diameter, and it made it very difficult more difficult especially for the retailer, to match up the fly line with a fly rod that was purchased. So in, I believe it was 1961, AFTA came up with this standardized system of fly lines, and what that allowed the manufacturers to do, both from the line end and the rod end, was get together and make it very simple for the retailer to go to the shelf, grab a 6-weight fly rod and a 6-weight fly line and a relevant reel, and say, here you go, it's ready to fish. As fly rods evolved, though, from cane to fiberglass to graphite, and then the further evolution, the more modern, faster or stiffer graphites, line weights started to they started to become a little bit more confusing. It was a little bit more difficult to just take say a 6-weight fly rod off the shelf, put a 6-weight line on it, and go fishing. There were several manufacturers of fly rods that were making faster than normal blanks, and we were finding that the rods, the 6-weight rods, needed another line right out of the gate, right out of off the shelf. So you would take this new modern fast fly rod from X manufacturer and take it to at a casting show or to a pond and put a 6-weight line on it, and you would immediately feel that it just wasn't loading properly. Even in the hands of a intermediate or slightly less than intermediate caster, it didn't work as well. So it started to become a source of frustration. The manufacturers, the fly line manufacturers, then said, well, if this is becoming fairly prevalent in the industry, why don't we make heavier fly lines? So they didn't necessarily deviate from the original AFTA standards, but what they did was they called their lines like a half a line weight over. So for example, I believe the first one to do this was the Scientific Angler GPX, about, I'm going to say probably maybe 20 years ago. It might not be that long, but it doesn't really matter. The GPX was a really nice line. It was a lovely taper, and it worked really well on most rods. Guys would pick it up and put a 6-weight line on their 6-weight rod and say, wow, this is really nice. So both the combination of the taper and the line weight being heavier made the rod load quicker and made everything happen faster. So the immediate benefit to that was, as I just said, that the heavier line loaded the rod faster and made everything happen quicker. Now, the AFTA, the original AFTA standard is still in place today. For example, a 6-weight line is 160 grains over the first 30 feet of fly line. So most modern fly lines are around 90 feet long, but they're only measured to the first 30 feet. Now, what does this mean in terms of how your rod performs and why and when you might want to overline it? What it means is, if you have a 6-weight rod that requires 160 grains at 30 feet, in order for that rod to be working at its optimum, you need to have 30 feet of line out of the end of your fly rod. Well, that's great, but we're not always needing 30 feet of line. So if you only have 18 or 20 feet of fly line out and then a 9-foot leader, you don't have enough grain weight beyond the rod tip to make that line work at its highest potential. In a field, or if you were fishing in a lake and you needed a lot of distance, odds are pretty good that the 6-weight line that your 6-weight rod calls for will work fine, because you are trying to, if you're working, say, a still water and crawling leeches back towards your boat or back towards the shore, you want to get as much distance as you can. Saltwater guys require a lot of distance. Atlantic salmon guys need distance. So in those cases, if you have an 8-weight rod and you put an 8-weight line on it, it's probably going to perform pretty well, because you'll not only have 30 feet of fly line beyond the rod tip, you'll actually have more than that. So you've got more grain weight outside of the rod tip, and that's going to allow the rod to work at its potential. But what happens when we get into a trout stream where we might only be making 10-foot casts? Another area that I really find that overlining your rod excels is when I'm say I'm bass fishing or trout fishing from the drift boat, and we're working a shoreline. As we're gliding down the river, the guide is presumably keeping the boat at a reasonable distance from the shoreline or the structure, and as you drift down, you can have one cast, because the shoreline is not perfectly even. It's not like you're going down a highway medium. The shoreline is moving in and out. There's juts and little bays and bits of structure, varying distances from the boat. So you may have one cast that's at 24 feet, but then your next cast might be at 55 feet. If you're shooting it into a little backwater or back eddy or a bay or something like that. But I think you get the point there. The idea is that the shoreline is not uniform, so you're not always casting the same distance. So for that 24-foot cast, or even shorter, by overlining your rod, say putting a 7-weight line on a 6-weight rod, by overlining it, you're getting more grain weight out of the rod tip with less amount of line. So the rod is working closer to its maximum potential. Several years ago, one of the big rod manufacturers introduced a line of rods, and they didn't actually put on them or state on the rod what weight it was. They were sort of species specific bass rods, and they were shorter. And when you first picked them up with the line, when you purchased the rod, it included a line. And when you first picked them up and cast them, to a man, everyone said, "Wow, this is amazing." The line shot like crazy, and it felt good. You knew it was going to be capable of carrying larger bass poppers, bigger streamers, weighted streamers, so on and so forth. Everything seemed to come together. But in reality, it wasn't the rod at all. The rod was short, which made it accurate and a little stiffer, but it was all in the line. And all they did was put a line on the rod heavier than what it called for, which is what we just talked about. And in this case, they actually overlined the rods by almost 3 lines. So when you're wanting to shoot great distances, you can start with less rod outside of the rod tip, and in fewer false casts, get that line back out to where the fish are. It also dealt with wind a lot of times on lakes. Pike, or muskie guys that are fishing lakes are not always dealing with ideal conditions, and if you've got a 30-40 kilometer wind blowing, it can be a bear. So having that heavier line to deal with the larger flies that we're typically throwing for those species, this made sense. So it wasn't in, going back to the rods again. It wasn't in the rods. It was the line that was really making the difference. And I think that's important to note, because one of the things that I always say about purchasing equipment is your fly line of the three, the rod, reel, and line. In my estimation, the fly line is probably the most important piece of the puzzle. If you have a line that's too light for your rod, it doesn't perform well until you get to that 30 plus range. And again, we're not always 30 feet isn't long to a skilled caster, but to someone just picking up the sport, 30 feet can be daunting. So for you know, again, the three components, I think the line is the most important. You can put a good quality, properly weighted line on a very inexpensive rod and make it work really well. And I do that. One of the things that I used to do in my schools was I went to Canadian Tire and I bought the cheapest piece of crap $19 fly rod that I could find, and I would put an appropriate line on that to show my students that, no, you don't have to spend, and I'm not saying go and spend $19.99 on a fly rod, but to illustrate the point, I put a good quality line on that piece of crap rod and made it work pretty well. So when you're overlining, when you're thinking about overlining your fly rod, you have to think about what you're going to be doing. So when I'm bass fishing, as I said, the majority of my bass fishing and muskie fishing is from a drift boat on a river. I will generally overline my rod by 2 line weights for the reasons I just said. You might have one cast that's at 18 feet, and then 3 casts later you could be at 55 or 60 feet. You're not going to fold the rod going 2 line weights over. I always add a caveat in here. You don't want to. I would always tell someone I'm lending that rod to, or letting use that rod, that it is overlined, and you don't have to muscle it. You can kind of let the line do the work. But when I'm throwing larger frog patterns, bass poppers, deer hair stuff, big, heavy, water-laden flies, or flies that tend to gather a lot of water, it makes sense to overline it by at least 1 line. It's not going to hurt it. And I'll add to that I overline every rod that I fish with. I overline by 1 line at least. As I was just saying, the bass rods I typically go 2 lines over. My standard smallmouth bass setup is a 6-weight rod with an 8-weight, just a general purpose line on a Real Gold is what I put on it. You can add you can put big fly lines on it. It won't hurt it. I just like the Real Gold because it's like I said, it's a fairly multi-purpose line, and giving it that extra 2 line weights really makes it work well. But going back to the trout fishing scenario, or another area where it really shines is indicator fishing or nymphing on smaller systems where the majority of your casting is only 8 to say 15 feet on smaller rivers. In the fall when we're steelhead fishing, rivers like in our region in southern Ontario, for those guys in this area that are watching it, and it doesn't matter where you are, every region's got its small, medium, and large rivers. But when I'm fishing, say a 10-foot 7-weight single-hand rod for steelhead, I don't mind at all putting a 9-weight rod on it because, a 9-weight line on it, because very few of my casts are beyond 20 feet. Plus, the heavier line helps to pull and move through the air, that heavily weighted indicator rig and turn everything over better. So it pays to overline your rod in these situations where you're generally making shorter casts. In the trout world, I don't find that it's as beneficial, because even when I'm nymphing for trout, I'm generally not using as heavy a rig. I might only have 2 or 3 size 8 split shots on my nymph rig and a very tiny indicator. So it's to make that happen, it's not as important to have your line, your rod overlined. But in the steelhead world, when we're using heavier gear, quite often having to get them down deeper on, and even on the larger rivers, it really pays off to overline the rod. And again, all you're doing is putting more grain weight outside of the rod tip at shorter distances, keeping in mind that the fly lines are weighed over the first 30 feet. As far as overlining all of your rods go, if I was doing a lot of dry fly fishing on a regular basis and I had a dedicated dry fly rod, I probably wouldn't necessarily overline that, only because I want to maintain some of the delicacy and finesse of, say, a Rio Trout LT, which is a fairly specific sort of dry fly line, and I'm generally casting greater distances when I'm dry fly fishing, because you can't get right on top of the fish. So in that case, there can be an argument that as long as I've got that 30 feet or more out, there's no need to overline your rod. But at the same time, it doesn't hurt. My standard, my gold standard on the Grand River, my home river, where I could be casting anywhere from 6 to 25 or 30 feet. Some of the lower reaches when we're fishing to rising fish, you might get to 50, 55 feet, but it doesn't happen on a regular basis. But my gold standard is a 9-foot 3-weight, but I put a 5-weight Rio Trout LT. Sorry, a 4-weight Rio Trout LT on it. The difference between one line weight up and the line that the rod calls for is negotiable. It's the average person wouldn't notice it. If I put it in the hands of a really skilled caster that's cast a lot of rods, he would probably make a couple of casts and say, yeah, that works pretty good, but is it overlined? You might notice it. It doesn't make it clunky, but what it does do is it, as I said before, it makes everything happen a little quicker. Deal with the wind a little bit better. Turn over larger flies a little bit better. So there are areas that we can overline your rod. Your best bet always is to get with your local shop and tell them what you're going to be doing. Whether you've got one rod to do everything or most of your fishing, or if you're looking for something specific, like you go in looking for a dedicated steelhead indicator rod. Let them walk you through it and show you exactly what you're doing. And I also recommend going out and casting them. Take them to a field with a couple of different rods, line weights, and feel the difference for yourself. It could pay off, and it could just improve sort of every aspect of your casting. And while I don't put a huge amount of import in an individual's casting ability, in the long run, it does pay off to have your ducks in a row in that area and be able to cast reasonably well. So if you're asking yourself, can I overline this fly rod, sorry, by all means, get with your shop pro and they can walk you through it and tell you whether it's going to work for you or whether you need it or whether you don't need it. And I think in the long run, you'll find that it is beneficial in many cases to overline your rod, and you should see an immediate improvement in the overall performance of your gear. If you have any questions, you can call us at 226-383-3474, or you can email us at info@grof.ca. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for next time.